So I'm hoping that this ends up being encouraging. So bear with me. I'm going to have a little bit of a PowerPoint, and I'm going to start with that. Okay, that's our Journal of Systemic Therapies, and this workshop is for prospective authors. Okay, what keeps therapists, what keeps these people that I'm talking to who have great ideas from publishing about their work? People will tell me I don't have time to do research. All I know about is what I do at my job, at my private practice, in my agency. I don't have any time to write, and I don't know where to start. So those are the questions we're going to try to address today. Let's look at some recent issues of the Journal of Systemic Therapies. And I just pulled some articles at random from recent issues. This is from our most recent issue, Racism and Friends, the relevance of racial literacy in clinical spaces. If you were reading that article, you might be asking yourself, have you ever felt that beginning therapists aren't properly trained to work with diverse clients? Have you ever felt like you're not properly trained, that you don't know what to do in certain situations? What does that whole concept of racial literacy mean? Those might be questions you were asking yourself. This is from earlier in June of 2022. We had an article about collaborative documentation, therapist experiences, and writing progress notes together. Have you ever had creative ideas about progress notes? Do you teach or train others, or you're part of a team? And have you ever thought about writing notes together? Those are questions you might be asking yourself. And those questions are responses to articles we already have in the field, in the journal, that are of interest in the field. Please note what these articles and all the other excellent articles that JST have in common. Many of them, these deal with issues that you're likely to encounter in your work as a therapist. They are not large-scale quantitative research studies, although we're always happy to look at your large-scale quantitative research study too. But if you don't have it, that doesn't mean you can't publish. Most importantly, they're part of continuing conversations in the journal. You can find articles in a number of issues over time about social justice and diversity issues, about documentation and the nuts and bolts of clinical practice, and just about how to be systemic out there in the real world. Those are the kinds of issues that we deal with, and those are the kinds of issues that you may be dealing with. Okay, so I'm stopping for a minute to see if there's anything in the chat. Okay, I'm going to move on. Our first step, we have like a steps for you to follow as you begin to put together an article. And your first step is reading. And the first step in reading is to pick a journal to get familiar with. And obviously, we're going to talk to you today about our journal. This is the website of the Journal of Systemic Therapies. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but notice that it is practice-oriented. We're interested in what you're doing as a therapist. We're interested in what other people are doing as a therapist. We're interested in what you're doing in agencies and in private practice and in your training institutions. We're interested in competency-oriented approaches. So that includes brief therapy, solution-focused therapy, collaborative dialogical therapies, narrative therapy, that whole wing of the field. And we're very interested in social justice principles. We want our articles to be reader-friendly. So we're not interested in there being in academic jargon or impossible to read for somebody who's not in a doctorate program. And we mention here some of our special section topics, and that'll kind of give you an idea of the journal. There's different journals. Some of you here today may be deciding, okay, this is not the journal for me. We come up right away in any search as a leading journal addressing systemic collaborative approaches. But if your approach, for example, is traditionally psychoanalytic, you might prefer the Psychoanalytic Review. Look on Guilford.com for all the journals available. You can also ask your local university librarian. But I'm assuming that for most of you, you're here today because our journal might be a good fit for you. So your next step is to get some access to journals. Let me really encourage you to get a subscription. You can get the Journal of Systemic Therapies for less than $7 a month, which at least here in South Florida is a lot less than it would take you to go out to lunch with a colleague. And this is like going out to lunch with a colleague every day, because you have not only the current issues, you have access to all the past issues and to all the conversations that have been going on in the journal for years, for decades. It's one of the best investments you can make in your writing career. If you want to, if you run out of money for subscriptions and you want to add some additional journals, you can also look at academic libraries if you still have access as a student or as an alumni. Don't forget, when you're searching, Google Scholar, because that will bring up articles, some of which will be open access, or which you can purchase article by article. I'm indebted to my predecessor as special sections editor, Jim Hibble, for reminding me that Amazon.com pays a lot of money for their search feature. And you can put in not only the next murder mystery or whatever you like to read, you can put in searches like single session therapy, and it will bring up not only books on that topic, but book chapters on that topic. And often they'll have a read inside feature. So you can see if you would like to order that book, either from your library or your local independent bookstore, or of course from Amazon itself. And libraries can order books for you. Okay, once you select your journal, once you get your access, once you're read a few issues, what are you trying to do? You're trying to join an ongoing conversation. What do I mean by an ongoing conversation? Back in 2021, you guys probably remember, there was a pandemic. We suddenly had to go to all online everything, right? And we had a special section in June of 2021 that talked about, gosh, what did we do in 2020? How did we survive? How did we rapidly adapt? There was a case study about doing teletherapy, moving to teletherapy from an in-person case. There was an interesting article about teletherapy in training and how this affected students who were trying to get their master's degree. And there was an interesting article about a clinical director at a nonprofit who suddenly, like overnight, had to transfer all of their cases to teletherapy. So that's what was happening back in 2021. We have a forthcoming article in the next issue of Journal of Systemic Therapies, Hospice Workers in the Pandemic, Re-envisioning Self-Care Systemically in a Time of Crisis. And that participates in that ongoing conversation, but it's looking backwards. Rochelle Clark, the first author, was a clinical director of a hospice in the height of the pandemic. Many hospices had to close because their workers all quit. The workers at this particular hospice had to be quarantined and had to actually stay there and could not go home for the duration. But she had very little turnover because she had a wonderful solution-focused self-care program. Now she's looking back at that. How did that work? What worked about that? And what does that tell us about how we could practice self-care today? Even if we're not in the same kind of crisis situation, we have other crises today. What does that tell us about the future? So that continues the conversation. So I'm hoping everybody sees how that's part of an ongoing conversation. Yeah, we'll share the PowerPoint later. So as you read, you're responding in your mind, and maybe you're jotting down notes. What do you do that's similar to what this author's doing? Do you have a self-care program? Do you practice self-care with yourself? Do you teach people about self-care? What do you do that's different? Her program was very solution-focused. Maybe you include some narrative principles, or maybe yours is like more collaborative, dialogical. What would you say or ask the authors if you were talking to them in person? So if you're sitting there talking to Rochelle and talking to Maria, who did the special sections back in 2021, what would you ask them about? What would you talk to them about based on what they've written? And what would they want to hear from you? What would they be interested in that you're doing, or you have done, or you are doing, or you're thinking about doing? What experiences have you had which you want to share with them if you were talking in person? Those kinds of conversations in your mind are the beginning of your article, because your article is a step towards a continuing conversation. So you do have an idea for an article. Think about what you agree with. Think about what you disagree with or see differently. Think about how your context is different. And I started this one because I find that people forget, because we all kind of get used to our own contexts. We forget how interesting different contexts are. When I was talking with Rochelle, I was fascinated by the context of a residential hospice and trying to provide therapy in that setting. And I think she didn't initially realize how different that would be for a lot of people. Whatever you're doing, it's different for a lot of us. Private practice, university, training center, agency, child welfare, whatever you're doing, we're not all doing that. And we could be very interested in how what you're doing, how you apply some of these principles to your very different context. And then how would you build on what the previous authors stated? Okay, they started off the conversation, they continued the conversation. What would you add to the conversation? Okay, so somebody in this workshop, even now, is sitting there saying, but my idea is completely new and unique in the history of the field. Okay, I can't really tie it into any of these other articles or ideas because mine is completely new. And I have two things to say about that. The first is, okay, let's assume that's true. That doesn't necessarily make your article more publishable. People think that we're looking for entirely new ideas, but we're really not. We're looking for a way to continue the conversation. And I was trying to think of an analogy of this, and I don't know if it works for you or not, but it worked for me. Here's the analogy I came up with. For many years, I've thought that somebody ought to do a movie about the life of Hedy Lamarr. I'm not sure if it's Hedy or Hedy, but I think it's Hedy Lamarr. She was like a B movie, not quite as famous as Jane Mansfield or Marilyn Monroe, but like a sex symbol siren type actress in the 50s. But she was also highly involved in the development of radar. So let's assume I get 5 minutes with Steven Spielberg, which is not going to happen. Let's assume I did. If I come in and I say, well, there was this woman who was involved in the development of radar, but the guys got more credit and she really didn't get as much credit as the guys did. He's already asleep, isn't he? Because we've heard this story before and it's not interesting. Not interesting enough for a movie. Okay, but let's say I've acquainted myself with the field. I'm aware that we had 2 blockbuster movies this summer that brought people back to the theaters, that made more money than many previous movies, and that this was a surprise because everybody thought, oh, people are just going to watch in their living room and do streaming. And wow, people have poured into the theaters this summer. So let's say I go into that movie and I say, I have this great into this meeting, and I say, I have this great idea for a movie. It's Barbie meets Oppenheimer. Okay, it's in that same World War II time period. It's the same saving the world from the Nazis, but there's this woman and she's like a Barbie. That's how people see her, but she's actually secretly a scientist. Okay, at least probably I have his attention, right? And in the same kind of way, when you have an idea that fits in with previous ideas, that helps us understand what you're trying to say, and that helps us want to add you to the ongoing conversation. So that's one response I would have. The other response I would have, of course, is that you might just think that you're the first person to have this idea in the history of the field. And I will share with you my humiliating graduate school paper, which was the first time that I tried to write an article all by myself. I had noticed that my supervisors were very interested in competency-oriented, positive models of therapy where they were focusing on people's strengths and abilities. And that's what they were doing in the therapy room, but they were often quite critical with students. And being a student myself, I didn't like that. I wanted them to be focusing on my strengths. So I thought, hey, therapy and supervision should be closer together. And I remembered the word isomorphic from my system studies. So I came up with the idea, that therapy and supervision should be isomorphic to each other. They should be more similar than different. I didn't find that in my text for the class. I hadn't read anything about it. So I presented it as a completely new idea. I got a C double minus on that paper, and my instructor handed it back to me with 2 single-space pages full of all the other people that had written on therapy and why therapy and supervision should be isomorphic. And that was a good lesson for me, because I learned that, my idea was not unique and new. Actually, quite a lot of people had written about it already. Things have a way of turning around over time. Actually, that first worst paper is not as bad a memory as it used to be. Years later, when I was a beginning faculty person myself, and I experienced what it's like to feel like you're the gatekeeper for the profession, and you may need to steer people away from becoming therapists if it's not really suited to them, and yet you want to focus on their strengths. I was talking about that with a couple of colleagues. They were having the same issues. This time we did do our homework and read all the articles about therapy and supervision being isomorphic. And guess what? There wasn't anything about how you do that in a university setting when you're also charged with being a gatekeeper for the profession. And we ended up writing an article together back in 1996, evaluating therapist practices in a postmodern world. And that, to this day, all 3 of us have written a lot of other things, but to this day, that remains one of the most cited articles for all 3 of us. So actually, my idea wasn't terrible, and it turned into something good, but not doing my homework was terrible. I mentioned that to say that even if a lot of other people have written about this idea that you have, don't let that discourage you. That's actually a good thing. That means that there's a lot of interest in the area. And you haven't written a lot in this area. So your unique perspective is still missing. The thing that makes you so curious about it is still missing. And it's a good thing to have lots of other writings in the area, a conversation that you can join in. Okay, so now you've read, and in your own mind, you've responded. What's your next step? Your next step is you want to review what you've read and what others have done before you. You're not right. If you're writing an article, you're not writing a dissertation. You're not writing an exhaustive review of the literature that includes everything that was ever presented. Okay, so that might help it seem less daunting. You don't need 250 references. I went through the most recent issue of the Journal of Systemic Therapies, and most articles had around 20, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but around 20, just enough to place you within the context of an ongoing conversation. And of course, most of the references are going to have to do with the journal that you're publishing in. They're going to be from other articles within that journal. See how reading is a first step, puts you a step ahead. Keep your references recent for the most part, because it's an ongoing conversation. Keep them brief, keep them relevant. And now you have a sense of the conversation that you're joining. So now you have your review, you're adding that to the responses that you had in your mind, and you're ready to relate to us your own story. Tell us your story that you want to tell us. Is it a case study of a client? Give us the context, but without identifying details. Give the little details that a fellow therapist would want to know. How did you handle payment? What exactly was this context? It could also be a case study, so to speak, of what you did in your organization, or your practice, or your training institution. It could be several brief case narratives with a common theme. Like you saw just a little bit about, you saw 4, 5, 6 clients with the same issue, and you want to talk about how you handled that. Could be a theoretical or hypothetical discussion. We have a forthcoming article in the next issue of the Journal of Systemic Therapies about crowdfunding for medical conditions. The increasing rise in people that are using GoFundMe to pay for their medical treatment. And while there's a little bit of a discussion about a couple of minor case examples that where this was touched on, most of the article is actually kind of like interesting speculation. What does that mean for us as therapists? It's a great article. I like it a lot. For example, the authors point out that if you have had to present yourself publicly as somebody who had no contributing factors to your disease, it just fell on you like a bolt from the blue, this medical condition that you have, you contributed to it in no way, shape, or form, and there's nothing you can do to make it better. And it's horrible and terrible, and it's going to ruin your whole life. That's what you need to do to get people to send in money to GoFundMe. That's what the best-selling campaigns, the campaigns that work, that's how people have to portray themselves. So if you have been portraying yourself publicly this way for months and you come into therapy, how willing are you going to be to look at your participation in your situation? How open are you going to be to the possibility of hope or change? And especially to the idea that you might be able to change some things when you've just been portraying yourself as a helpless victim. So I think it's a very interesting idea. So there are lots of different kinds of articles that we're interested in. Tell us, while you're telling us about what you're thinking about and what you've done, tell us about the follow-up. I hear a lot of people say, I don't have any follow-up. I was not able to have a control group. I did not have a large sample. We know it's not classical research because you're not presenting it as a research study, but there's other kinds of follow-up. Did you hear from your client later? Is your client doing okay now? What does your client think about what happened? Maybe you can even include your client's voice in the paper. What does your supervisee say about what the experience was like? Maybe you could include that voice. In your organization, maybe you did a little informal survey or a focus group or structured conversations. Maybe you expanded on the idea later. I'm going to use Rochelle's article as a good example again, because she had such great findings and she didn't necessarily realize at first how wonderful they were. She said to me, we don't have a control group. We don't have any outcome data really. But I asked her, how did you know that the self-care program was working? What made you continue it instead of stop it? And she said, because all the other hospices in the area had to close because so many of their employees quit. And we didn't have any attrition. Well, that's a big follow-up. That's something that tells you, hey, something was working about that. Doesn't have to be a classical research outcome for you to be able to tell us why you think this is a good idea, why you think it's interesting, or why you think it failed. That's interesting also. Okay, so I'm going to stop at this point, see if anybody has any pressing questions in the chat or anything. Okay, and I'm going to go on to talk about why writing should be fun and how to make it fun. This is the point where you've reviewed, you've responded, you're getting ready to tell your story. Writing is a wonderful and joyful process. And I want to share that with you. And I want to share some ideas that I've learned over the years from my mentors, in particular, about ways to make that a joyful process. I see that Harleen Anderson is here, so I have to give her a shout out. The first and probably most important thing I learned was from her when I was a supervisee in an article she was writing about supervision, and I was just writing my response to the supervision. I got totally paralyzed. I would write a sentence and then I would rewrite the sentence and then I would decide it wasn't any good and delete the sentence and then I would have nothing, right? And that went on. And she talk to me about writing first and editing later. And Harleen, I'm sorry, I don't remember whether this was a metaphor that you used or a metaphor that you just caused to come into my mind. Harleen speaks as beautifully as she writes, and sometimes the ideas just come into your head because you're talking to her. But I've used this metaphor ever since, and the metaphor is a garden. That when you first start writing, you're scattering a bunch of seeds and you don't know what's going to come up. There are going to be some flowers, some beautiful ideas, but there are also going to be some weeds. And there's going to be stuff you don't know how it got in there. There's like a boot in the corner of the garden and you have no idea how it got there. But that's okay, because what you want is to have something alive. What you want is to have a growing thing, a growing experience, a creation. You can always go back later and weed and prune, and in fact, you'll have to. But if you start weeding and pruning from the beginning, you're not giving the seeds a chance to come up. So the first thing you want to do is write whatever comes into your head. Tell us the story. Don't try to edit at that point. The editing will come later. All right, my second big lesson from a mentor was from my colleague, Ron Schnei, who is himself the editor of a journal, The Qualitative Report. And he knew me as a colleague when I was trying to write my first book. I had a year-old baby. a job that was more than full-time, a lot of things on my plate, and I was making myself crazy trying to find time to write. I was trying to write over my lunch hour. I was trying to write, if I had a spare half hour, I was trying to write. I was trying to write all the time, and yet nothing was happening. I wasn't producing anything. And Ron took me aside and pointed out to me that in his experience, it takes an hour, about an hour, to get back into what it is that you're trying to write, to remember your ideas, to remember the articles that you've reviewed, to remember what it is, what context it is, what conversation you're trying to join, just to get back into that place. And it takes about another hour to get out, to save everything that you did, to do any little preliminary edits, to be done with what you accomplished. That means he suggested that I schedule only 3-hour blocks. And he promised me that that middle hour would be incredibly productive. And it was. If you give yourself an hour to get in and an hour to get out, that middle hour, you'll find that you're writing 10, 15 pages because you're in the zone. Of course, if you can make it 5 hours, then you have 3 incredibly productive hours in the middle. But if you can't, if you can only make it 3 hours, that works. If you can't do 3 hours once a week, maybe you can do 3 hours every other week. That's still going to be more productive than trying to write 15 minutes here, 20 minutes there, 45 minutes there, and duplicating and not really remembering what you're doing. And that's been very useful advice for me. So I pass it on. You may be different, but it's something to think about if you feel like you're spinning your wheels and not getting anywhere with your writing. Are you giving yourself enough time? Are you giving yourself that block of time? And I know it's hard to find that block of time, but you will find that in that block of time, once you're in the zone, you are incredibly productive. And then you're not making yourself crazy trying to write in little 15-minute stretches. Now I have an addendum to that idea, and this is for me, so I present it tentatively. I'm not sure if this is gender related or just situation related, but I wrote my first book with the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning in the International House of Pancakes close to my house, which was open 24 hours. And that was because I could not write at home. And I find over the years, I've 30 years now, I've been mentoring people writing their dissertations and people writing their first articles and people first venturing into publication. Many of my dissertation students are female, and I find that nearly all of them cannot write at home. And that is because if you are wearing many hats, your home is talking to you while you're trying to write. Your home is saying, as long as you're sitting there writing, you might as well put in a load of laundry. At least you could start the dishwasher. I hear a noise. Is that the baby waking up? Is that your phone going off? Is there a text? And your home is constantly talking to you, and it makes it very hard to focus. So you may need to find another place to write. I don't necessarily recommend International House of Pancakes. There's too much of a temptation to write pancakes, but you could find a coffee shop, or you could find a library, or you could find your own office after hours, or you could find a tree trunk in your backyard where you can balance your laptop and take a chair out there and be away. You may find if you're having trouble writing that you need to get away from your house. Oh, and I have some people who are resonating to this. Okay, so congratulations. You wrote something. You're there. You have experienced that joy of creativity, and you actually have a draft. This is an exciting moment, and you should feel pleased with yourself. And also, you're not done. You're not done. We got to move on to the next step. You do have something unique to say. Your voice is important, and we're excited that you've written something, and we want to help you. The next step is revising. You read, you responded, you reviewed what other people had to say, you related your story, and now you're in revising. And that is usually not people's favorite step. If we continue our garden analogy, that is more like the weeding and pruning part. But it's important because it's what's going to make your article really, really good. First, do your own revisions. I'm just looking in the chat to see if other people said stuff. First, do your own revisions. Here's a link to APA style. If you need a little refresher, if you need to see how exactly you should do your citations, they'll walk you through it. And here's our Journal of Systemic Therapies submission guidelines. I'm not going to read them all, but they are up there on the website. They're really helpful. They tell you what font to use, that you should double space, what your margins should be. They give you an idea of how long the article should be. They tell you what the abstract should be. They walk you through it. Go ahead and use that resource and polish up your article as much as you can before you send it to the journal, because you're just saving yourself time. And you're presenting your article and your idea in the best possible way. You're dressing it up before you send it out in public. And that way you're giving it its best chance. Now, once you do that, then you need to be open to revisions from others. This is what makes a journal peer-reviewed. This is what makes a book edited, and why big textbooks in the field are professionally published and edited and not self-published, because you have that step of other people's eyes on it. I know that that can feel difficult, but we all go through it, and it's what makes the process collaborative. Try not to get defensive about it. The reviewers are actually here to help you. The reviewers are chosen, peer reviewers are chosen because they have a lot of knowledge and interest in the area that you're writing about. So if they don't understand what you're saying in a particular paragraph, the odds are really good that your readers aren't going to understand it either. So we need to find another way to put it. And they can have helpful suggestions about their questions, can lead you to a clearer way to put it. If they got confused or they think you're misstating something, great. This is your opportunity to fix that before all your readers see it. We're all on the same side. We all want to make your articles shine and your ideas shine, and we want it to have maximum influence in the field. So try to be open to the reviewing process. Now, there are a couple of different ways that you can submit your article. There's the regular section versus the special section. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about that. The regular section is the most direct route. You and anybody else that's writing the article with you, you finish up your article and polish it up, make sure that the formatting is perfect, and you send it in to our senior editor, Jim Duvall, and he sends it out to the peer reviewers. The peer reviewers get back with you, give you their feedback, you make your needed revisions, and hopefully your article is then accepted for publication. It's like the most direct route. Okay, with this special section, you put in a little more time and energy, but you also get more help and more involvement along the way, and you actually end up with more publications. For a special section, you need to collect 3 articles. They don't all have to be written by you. One or more of them may be written by you, perhaps with co-authors, but you may also know somebody who's interested in the same theme and who's working on an article. You can bring them in too. You should recruit for these, and you should look at your articles and the other people's articles, at all 3 of the articles, and do your own editing and revising and make them as nice as you can be. I, as the special sections editor, will help you edit and revise. At that point, I will even help you earlier in terms of helping you recruit if you need help recruiting people who are writing on this theme, and helping you with the editing as you go along, helping you with ideas as you go along. I'm there almost as an assistant to help you with the experience. When you and I, you're the guest editor of the special section. When you and I are both happy with the 3 articles, then we send them to Jim Duvall, and he then sends them out to peer reviewers. But we're usually able to expedite that review a little bit because the articles have already been through a couple of sets of eyes. They've already been polished. And then, assuming all goes well, you will publish your article, or your 2 articles or your 3 articles, plus the other articles that you collected that you didn't write, but you helped edit, and you get to write an introduction tying the 3 together, which is an additional publication for you. So there's two different ways to submit, and you can think about what's best for you. I was trying to think of an analogy for this, and here's the analogy that came to me. I recently flew to England to present at a workshop in Oxford. I flew to London, and I took my daughter with me, my now grown daughter. And it was a nice mother-daughter bonding time. I was thrilled that we were able to get seats, and it was a nonstop flight, and we got to London in what seemed to me in a very short period of time, and I was happy with that. It was the most direct route. It was less money than I thought it would be, and I was pleased. As we got off the plane, my daughter said to me, "Mom, you need to start earning more money, because I am never again flying economy basic," which was the name of our seats. There was one step up from the cargo hold. She had a point, right? But she had been looking with envy. You don't even get to see the first class passengers, although I assume they're having a good time. But she was looking with envy at the premium and business class passengers, and she saw that they had like attendants who were coming around and seeing if they needed anything, and asking after their comfort and bringing them blankets and things like that, which was definitely not happening for us back there in what was basically the cargo hold. And she wanted that. So I thought that was actually a good analogy. If you just want the most direct route to getting your article published, just send it in over the transom to our senior editor. If you're willing to put in thankfully, it doesn't cost any more money, unlike premium class. If you are willing to put in more time and effort, though, you can get yourself an attendant. You can get yourself more service. You can get yourself a special sections editor who's working with you and expediting the process for you. So it's sort of like business class. And it's up to you what you want to do. We're happy to get articles either way. Okay, here's some recent special section topics. Working towards social change in the midst of the pandemic. In the midst of a pandemic and unjust practices, like a seized from the headlines type special section. That's the one that's coming up this summer. COVID-19 and teletherapy. You see how the conversations build. That was a previous one. Now we're working towards what's happening now. Here's another couple of special sections where the conversation built on each other. The first one, I'm going backwards in time down this list. The first one was about single session therapy, an excellent special section presenting some case studies and a little bit of research on single session therapy and how well it's working. Then the next special section we had was on single session walk-in therapy as implemented in Canada. In Canada, they had 6 months and year-long waiting lists in their free public clinics, and an administrative decision was made. All right, we're going to move towards single session. You can come back again if you want, but we're not scheduling a recurring appointment. Single session walk-in solution-focused therapy is now the norm, and this was implemented administratively. So the clinical directors had to essentially say to therapists who were not happy with it, this is what we're doing now. So that made for an interesting special section, how that went and how therapists adapted to that. And again, that was part of the ongoing conversation that started with the single session therapy. Before that, we had a special section about applied diversity. All right, we learned about diversity and social justice and equity issues. What does it actually look like in practice? And how do you work around the hard issues like your client is about to be deported by ICE? What do you do? So that gives you an idea of different special section topics. As a special sections editor, I would love to see, here's some I would love to see. I would love to see some more school-based applications. In the rest of my life, I am the chair-elect of the WMFT's Family Therapist in Schools. I do a lot of research and work in public schools, and I know that there's an increasing number of family therapists in schools. They're hiring them like crazy. I'd love to see some articles about that. I'd love to see some articles about supervision, teaching, training. That's something that we all do as well as therapy, but we don't have nearly as many articles about. Love to see some articles about gun violence. Working in the schools, that's something that's ever present in my mind. My university, my program, we were deeply involved after the Parkland school shooting. I'm in touch now with other therapists. They reached out to me from Nashville for some discussion of how we survived Parkland. The people from Sandy Hook were very helpful to me when we were going through Parkland. Gun violence is a huge issue, not just in schools, but in all kinds of other contexts. And I'd love to see some more articles about that. And you may have some very interesting ideas for special sections that I haven't even thought about. Oh, somebody in the chat is saying narrative therapy with incarcerated people. I love that. How about a special section just on working with incarcerated people? Some of it could be narrative therapy, some of it could be other kinds of therapy. If it's all narrative therapy, that's great. That would make a great special section. I have a call. We have Tracy Robinson Wood at Northeastern is currently working on a special section. She's the guest editor, and she sent me this little call for papers. This is a special section on anti-racism and social justice. So she's looking for articles focused on recognizing, reading, and resolving racism and companion impressions like heteronormativity and patriarchy that lurk within clinical and educational spaces. I love that language. And here was another phrase that the bold and the italics are mine. I loved this phrase too. She's looking for articles that talk about upending practices that promote human hierarchy. So in other words, how could you level the playing field? How could you do away with hierarchy within these settings, whether it be clinical settings or educational settings? So that's a very interesting idea. And here's her contact information. And if you have an article that you're working on that you think would fit in her special section, by all means, reach out to her. Or an idea for an article. Okay, so I have been talking a lot, and I wanted to stop now and ask about questions. And I also wanted to give you a chance to talk with each other. But first, since I have been talking nonstop, let me ask for questions from the group.